My family mocked me at my cousin's wedding, but they all stepped back when my husband arrived. The moment I stepped onto the stone path leading to the garden terrace, I could feel their eyes. Not warm, not curious, not even surprised, just sharp-cutting scanning. As if trying to figure out what brand my dress was, what failure I must be hiding this time, and why I'd dared to show up after all these years. The ceremony hadn't started yet, but the air already felt heavy. And the truth was, I hadn't seen most of these people in almost 8 years. They had written me off long ago. So whatever version of me they were expecting bitter broke, forgotten they were not ready for who I had become. They definitely weren't ready for who was about to walk through the doors behind me. My name is Dove Cameron. I'm 33 years old, and I co-founded a digital storytelling startup called Haven Frame Studios. We work on projects that capture real, often uncomfortable human stories. Abuse survivors. Artists who rebuilt after being erased. Communities that were displaced and forgotten. And yes, once in a while we tell stories like mine about family betrayal, silence, and then voice. But none of that success happened overnight. And it didn't happen with applause from the people who claimed to love me. I was born into the Quinn family. Old money, East Coast power, private equity wrapped in vineyard charm. Our name was on publishing houses, media companies, and real estate portfolios most people only read about. Our reputation came before our humanity. My father died when I was 10, and my uncle Colton stepped into the vacuum like he'd been waiting for the crown his whole life. He ran Quinn Media like a dynasty, and everyone who stayed in line was rewarded with a seat at the long polished table. Those who strayed like my mother or me were quickly nudged out of frame. I'd been the creative one. Not the corporate type, not the kind who saw spreadsheets and thought legacy. I saw stories, emotion, impact. My mother, a book editor, who never quite belonged to the Quinn elite, tried to shield me from the expectations. But after she passed from ovarian cancer when I was 22, there was no one left standing between me and the machine. I still remember the day I walked into the family boardroom clutching a concept for a digital narrative lab and pitched it like my life depended on it. Because it did. And I still remember the quiet afterward followed by a single scoff from Meredith, my father's second wife, and now full matriarch by proxy. She turned to Colton and said, "This isn't storytelling. This is charity work in tech clothing." They smiled, politely told me to focus on social campaigns instead, and by that weekend my name had been removed from the internal communications roster. They didn't fire me, that would have made noise. They just quietly replaced me with Devon Meredith's son from her first marriage and shifted my salary into a strategic reallocation. I walked out of that building with no job, no health insurance, and no access to any of the projects I had helped initiate. I didn't even get to pack my desk. I was 24. No savings, no partner, no safety net. But I had a laptop and a story to tell. So I left Boston and moved to Seattle with the last $1,200 I had. Rented a room above a cafe and started recording voice journals about grief, erasure, and rebuilding. It wasn't meant to be a podcast. It was therapy. But those raw, unscripted uploads found an audience. One of them found Kai. He reached out after my 4th post went semi-viral, saying he wasn't offering pity or sponsorship. He just wanted to talk about something he called civic signal restoration. At first I thought it was code for some scam, but we ended up talking for 6 hours. About identity, memory, capitalism, and sound. He didn't ask what happened with my family. He asked what kind of stories I wasn't brave enough to tell yet. 2 years later, we were married in a lighthouse on Whidbey Island, witnessed by only 7 people, and a weathered dog named Jasper. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. I wore a gray silk wrap and read him my vows off a notebook page torn from an old poetry journal. He had no tie, just a deep blue sweater and eyes that didn't flinch when I told him I still had nightmares of polished boardrooms and silent exits. Our wedding photos don't have flower walls or champagne towers. But they glow. Now, after 4 years of building Haven Frame together, after dozens of stories launched, and after 3 near acquisitions we turned down just to keep our platform independent, I had gotten comfortable with silence. I didn't respond to family emails. I skipped holiday invitations. I didn't even open the forwarded article announcing Avery's engagement to the heir of Rothmore Digital, but I opened the envelope when it came. The wedding invitation. gold-foiled hand-lettered with a note from Avery. Please come, Dove. I still remember you and me under the marble staircase reading ghost stories while everyone else practiced their speeches. I stared at that note for hours. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She used to be the only one who looked at me like I wasn't wasting air. And now she was marrying into a dynasty of her own. Something about that hit harder than I expected. I hadn't decided whether I would go, until I saw the guest list preview in a digital press release that named every distinguished member of the Quinn legacy except me. I told Kai about the wedding while we were cleaning out our storage room. He was on a ladder, handing me old frames wrapped in brown paper, and I handed him the invitation without saying a word. He looked at the envelope, then at me, and waited. That's something I've always admired about him. He doesn't rush my stories, he gives them space to unfold without force. I finally said, "It's Avery. She's getting married next month. She wants me to come." He didn't ask why she would invite me. He didn't bring up the years of silence or the mess I used to wake up from in cold sweats. He just asked, "Do you want to go?" And I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't angry anymore. I had made peace, or so I thought. But when I held that card in my hands, something opened. Not bitterness, not revenge, just a need to witness. To see with my own eyes what that world had become without me and what I had become without them. We decided I'd go alone for the ceremony. Kai had a speaking engagement the night before and would fly in for the reception. It felt cleaner that way, like I could walk through the fire without dragging him into the smoke. I booked a modest cabin near the venue, no chance I'd stay at the Quinn estate, and bought a dark green dress that felt quiet but strong. I didn't need to make a statement, just be impossible to ignore. The night before the wedding, I sat on the deck of the cabin watching the pines blur into the dusk and tried to prepare myself. I hadn't seen Colton in almost a decade. Not since the day he told me in front of the entire board that I was emotionally unscalable. That phrase had haunted me for years. I'd replayed that moment in my head so often I'd memorized the shape of the sentence as it left his mouth. At the time, it broke something in me. But now, with the cold air biting at my skin and the memory growing distant, it almost made me laugh. What did that even mean, that I wasn't cold enough to monetize my own pain? Avery had been the only softness left in that house. When we were kids, we used to sneak into the archive room and record voice memos pretending we were foreign correspondents. She had this voice clear, curious, never cruel. But after my exile, she stopped reaching out. No calls, no emails, just silence. I knew Colton must have gotten to her. Or maybe she was just protecting her own seat at the table. Either way, that version of Avery, the one who used to send me scribbled poetry under the breakfast napkins, she felt like someone I'd imagined. The morning of the wedding was cold but dry. I wore a black wool coat over the dress and a simple silver chain. I didn't pack anything flashy, nothing with a label anyone could weaponize. My ride dropped me off at the entrance to the venue, a converted estate nestled in the foothills of Colorado, surrounded by white blossoms and white faces that hadn't aged kindly. The check-in desk had a line, and when I gave my name, the planner did a double take before offering a tight smile and a small nod. "Quinn party, correct?" she asked, already glancing at the seating chart. I hesitated then, said technically. "But Dove, Cameron." She paused, registered it, and pointed toward a far table in the last section. "You're in D6. Ceremony begins in 20 minutes. Section D. I could have guessed. I didn't even bother asking if Avery was around. If they wanted to tuck me into the shadows, let them. I'd brought my own light. But even so, the walk to the back rows was longer than I expected. I passed familiar faces. Meredith, in a silver sheath dress, barely concealed her look of disbelief when our eyes met. She recovered quickly, turned away, and murmured something into the flute of her champagne. Blake, her son now, balding and bloated in a way that suggested fast success and faster decline, smirked openly when he saw me. Back from the land of the lost, he whispered to someone behind him. I took my seat and kept my hands still on my lap. The guests began to file in. I heard someone say my name, half question, half rumor. "Is that Dove? Didn't she start a blog or something?" Another voice answered. "Thought she got sued for defamation. Or was it some kind of anti-corporate thing? I could have corrected them. But what would be the point? Their opinion was built on absence, and I didn't owe them clarity. The ceremony space was grand, but artificial. Nothing felt rooted. Even the flower arch seemed to sag under the pressure of trying too hard. When Avery finally appeared walking down the aisle with practiced grace, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked beautiful, poised, edited. Like every part of her had been rehearsed until it no longer resembled a person, just a brand. Our eyes met for half a second. She blinked, and something passed through her face, but then she looked away. They exchanged vows. The crowd applauded. Cameras clicked like rifles, and I sat there wondering how many people here remembered who I used to be, and how many had rewritten me as a cautionary tale. When the music ended and people began heading toward the cocktail terrace, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. Kai had texted, "Landed. 35 minutes out. You okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Not yet, but I will be." The cocktail hour was held in a glass pavilion that overlooked the canyon. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with money and tension, the kind that sits just beneath the clink of crystal and the polite laughter that never reaches anyone's eyes. I made my way to a standing table near the edge of the room, partly because the view gave me something to look at that wasn't a smirk or a whisper, and partly because no one had offered me a drink. I was invisible again, and it wasn't accidental. It was curated. Meredith spotted me first. She approached with the glide of someone who lives on core Pilates and perception control. Her gown was structured flawless, just like her tone. "Dove," she said lightly, touching my elbow as though I might bruise the fabric of the party. "How unexpected." "Avery mentioned she sent you an invitation, but we weren't sure you'd come." I met her gaze steady. "And yet here I am." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Still doing that podcast thing?" she asked, tilting her head like she was genuinely unsure if it was a hobby or a symptom. "Actually, we're now a platform for civic journalism and trauma-informed storytelling. We work with international aid organizations." I said it without pride, just precision. She blinked, already disinterested. "How nice," she murmured before slipping away with the practiced air of someone who always knows when a conversation has outlived its usefulness. I turned back to the window. Beyond the glass, the pine trees swayed with a kind of quiet dignity. I envied them. Someone brushed past me too closely, a whiff of cologne I remembered from childhood gatherings. Blake. Now bloated with borrowed confidence and hedge fund bravado. "Look who came crawling back," he muttered under his breath, sipping from a glass that clearly wasn't his first. "Didn't think you had the guts to show up. Or the means." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He wouldn't have understood the cost of my silence. Across the room, I caught sight of Avery standing beside her new husband as they greeted well-dressed guests in a slow, rehearsed rotation. Her expression was poised, pleasant, but she looked tired in the way that can't be fixed with makeup or rest. Our eyes met again. She gave me a brief nod. I didn't move. The clinking of a fork on a glass signaled the start of a toast. Uncle Colton had arrived. He was still tall, still crisp, still possessed of that boardroom voice that sounded like it had been trained on dominance algorithms. He raised his glass and smiled like a lion in a suit. "To new beginnings," he declared. "To legacy. To family in the truest sense of the word." His eyes swept the room until they landed on me briefly, as if he were addressing a blemish. And to those who stayed the course, the laughter that followed was gentle but pointed, a ripple of alignment. I sipped from a glass I hadn't realized had been placed in front of me. I stepped outside for air. The cold steadied me more than any affirmation ever could. My phone buzzed again. "Kai, 10 minutes. You okay?" I replied simply. "They're predictable." He wrote back. "That's their weakness." I smiled without meaning to. Back inside, I decided to find the bathroom. I didn't trust myself to keep absorbing these little slights without fracturing. On my way, I passed a group of cousins huddled near the charcuterie, one of them whispering I heard she lives in a warehouse now, with like artists and tech weirdos. Another laughed she probably Ubered here. If she still has a phone. Their voices weren't cruel so much as amused. To them I was a character, an anecdote, a warning. I stopped just long enough to let them know I heard, then kept walking. The powder room was all marble and soft lighting. I stared at myself in the mirror and saw a woman who didn't match the narrative they'd crafted in her absence. They were still clinging to the girl who left Boston with no job and a busted laptop, not the woman who co-led a platform now studied in ethics courses. I washed my hands, fixed my necklace, and reminded myself why I came. Not for revenge, not even for closure, for truth, to stand in the room and not flinch, to prove, if only to myself, that I no longer needed their version of me to survive. As I stepped out of the restroom, I nearly collided with Devin, Meredith's golden boy. Sharp suit, slick smile, empty core. "Dove," he said, as if greeting an old classmate he vaguely remembered from a networking event. "Heard you're in storytelling now. Very creative." I nodded. "Heard you're still in acquisitions. Very risk-averse." His smile faltered just for a beat. Then, he recovered. "So still single?" he asked. "Or did you marry one of those activist types?" "My husband's on his way," I said. "He builds tech that protects whistleblowers and documents war crimes. He's funded by 3 international human rights foundations." Devin blinked. "Sounds complicated." I shrugged. "Only for people used to linear success." I walked away before he could respond. The ballroom doors were opening now. We were being invited to the reception. I took a deep breath and followed the crowd in, not behind them but beside them. No longer avoiding, no longer hiding. Just walking toward what was mine to witness. The reception hall had been transformed into a winter-themed fantasy, all shimmering glass metallic florals and soft lavender lighting meant to make people feel important in photos. But even the most expensive staging couldn't hide how seating assignments reflected power. I was at table 18-inch, the far back corner next to the service entrance. The chairs were slightly mismatched. There were no place cards with names embossed in gold. The floral centerpiece was smaller, its petals slightly wilted. It was the kind of detail only someone like Meredith would have orchestrated, intentional enough to sting but subtle enough to be denied if questioned. At my table were a retired couple I didn't recognize, probably guests of the groom's side, and a cousin from Arizona whose last words to me had been, "Our podcast's like radio for millennials." None of them seemed particularly interested in conversation. Which was fine. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to be seen. But as I looked toward the front of the room, I noticed something else. Avery's eyes had found me again. And this time she didn't look away. The toasts began. James's father spoke first, welcoming Avery into the family with the tone of a man who treats business deals like marriages, and vice versa. Then came Colton. His glass lifted, his voice steady. He began what might as well have been a keynote. He talked about legacy, about the union of 2 powerful families, about commitment, duty, and excellence. Every word sounded like it had been drafted by a publicist and rehearsed in a mirror. Then came the pivot. "Of course," he said, his eyes grazing over the tables like a laser finding its mark, "not every path leads to honor. Some in our extended circle have chosen alternate definitions of success. And while we wish them well in their endeavors, tonight is about celebrating those who stayed true to their values, to family." His voice lingered on that last word. Some guests chuckled. I didn't need a spotlight to know where it landed. I kept my expression neutral, eyes low. My hands remained on my lap still. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feed their narrative. The room applauded, glasses clinked. I sipped water that tasted faintly of metal and reminded myself of the text in my coat pocket. Kai was 20 minutes out. Dinner was served. Conversation resumed. At the next table, I heard Devin loudly explaining the intricacies of market dominance to someone who wasn't asking. Across the room, Meredith held court with a small cluster of women who looked like they had all coordinated Botox appointments the same week. It was all so sterile, so carefully arranged to reflect wealth but not depth. Like a branded dream with nothing at its center. Then came Blake. Again. This time emboldened by whiskey and the weight of generational immunity. He ambled over with a half-eaten canapé and a smirk that hadn't aged well. "I gotta admit," he said, lowering himself into the empty seat, "next to me you've got guts showing up here. Thought you vanished into the podcast void." I stayed quiet. He leaned closer. "What's it like living off art and idealism? Do you guys like barter for rent? Paint someone's fence in exchange for Wi-Fi?" The table laughed politely. I didn't My husband and I run a profitable studio, I said evenly. We're independently funded and consult for organizations you probably donate to for tax reasons. His smile faltered, but he covered it with a laugh. Touché, he said, rising. Still sharp. I'll give you that. As he left, I caught sight of a server approaching with a tray. He glanced nervously between me and the table, then lowered the tray. Ma'am, he said softly, a guest requested this for you. I looked down. A single glass of champagne and a folded note on ivory paper. No name, just a message in clean handwriting. Hold your ground, they're loudest when they're afraid. I didn't recognize the writing, but I folded the note and slipped it into my clutch without hesitation. Somewhere in the room someone remembered, or someone saw clearly. Either way, it was enough. A moment later, the room hushed as Avery and James took their first dance. The spotlight circled the crowd, leaned in. It was beautiful, staged, choreographed to perfection. But as they turned slowly under the crystal chandelier, I saw Avery glance toward me just once, before looking back at her husband. And something in her eyes, hesitation, maybe guilt, maybe longing, cut deeper than all the toasts combined. I checked my phone. A message from Kai had just come in. Parking now. See you in 3. I stood, adjusted my dress, and moved toward the edge of the room. Because whatever came next, I wasn't going to face it sitting down. The doors opened, just as the second round of champagne was being poured. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in the room before I even heard his voice. Kai had a way of entering spaces that made people stop mid-sentence without knowing why. It wasn't because he was famous. It was something quieter than that, like gravity changing direction. I turned just in time to see him walking across the ballroom floor in a dark, tailored suit I hadn't seen before. He moved with calm precision, not hurrying, not slowing, just moving forward as though he belonged exactly where he was. His eyes found mine instantly, and in that single glance my shoulders loosened. He walked straight to me, kissed my cheek lightly, and said loud enough for those nearby to hear. Sorry I'm late. The mountain traffic was worse than expected. I nodded and steadied my breath. Just his presence had drawn the attention of half the room, not because they recognized him, but because they couldn't place him. And not being able to place someone at an event like this makes people very nervous. Colton noticed him next. I saw it happen like a chain reaction. His brows drew together for a second, then smoothed into a kind of half-curious calculation. He made his way toward us, with the gait of someone who'd built a career on interruption disguised as conversation. And who might this be, he asked already, assuming the answer would confirm some failure. This is my husband, I said calmly. Kai Evans. The name alone was enough to make a few nearby faces twitch. Colton hesitated, then extended a hand with forced civility. Ah, a pleasure. What do you do, Mr. Evans? Kai didn't flinch. I work in digital security and ethical content infrastructure. We design safe environments for human rights documentation. Colton blinked. That's a mouthful. Kai's smile didn't change. So is legacy. But it doesn't mean much if it can't hold weight. That landed like a dull bell between them. I felt the room tilt. Meredith appeared beside Colton, her eyes scanning Kai's cufflinks like they were name tags. We had no idea Dove had married, she said with her signature feigned delight. It wasn't news, I replied. Just private. Her mouth curled slightly the way it did when she was deciding how much effort a performance was worth. Well, you're certainly full of surprises tonight. She gestured toward my neckline. Is that the same necklace you wore years ago? From that summer at the vineyard, I nodded. Same stone, new setting. Like most things in my life, Meredith's smile hardened, and she turned her attention to another guest, as though she hadn't just attempted a subtle jab and missed. Colton stepped forward again. Let's speak plainly, Dove. Whatever this return is, whatever point you're trying to prove, I suggest you let it go. This isn't your world anymore. You had a chance. You chose otherwise. His voice was measured, not cruel, but each word was designed to sting without leaving a mark. You're mistaken, I said. I didn't come here to reclaim a seat. I came to see someone I once cared about. You made sure the rest of it was no longer mine a long time ago. He chuckled softly, then looked at Kai as if seeking confirmation. You know it's noble to support your partner's dreams, but don't let her rewrite history. She had every opportunity. She just didn't know how to manage them. Kai looked at him for a long moment, then said in a tone so calm, it was chilling. You confuse obedience with potential. That's dangerous in a family business. Or any system, really. Something in Colton's expression shifted, then a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of recognition that the man in front of him wasn't someone who could be easily folded into a narrative. He looked at me then, down at the necklace resting just above my collarbone. Without warning, he reached forward, grabbed the chain, and yanked it. The clasp snapped, and the pendant dropped to the floor with a sound that cut through the background music. Gasps followed, slow and rippling. I bent down, picked it up gently, and straightened, without saying a word. My palm closed around the stone. Colton stepped back, his voice louder, now less controlled. You think that necklace makes you someone. You think your little podcasts and nonprofit projects matter. He turned to the crowd, now no longer pretending this was a private exchange. She walked out. On her name. On her family. And now she wants applause because her husband bought her a microphone. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical. Guests froze mid-chew. Even the servers stopped moving. I looked directly at Colton and said only this: "You'll regret making that your legacy." Then I turned to Kai and whispered, "You okay?" He nodded once, then reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small velvet box. "I brought the backup chain, in case your past tried to break it." The line wasn't meant for anyone else, but it echoed, and judging by the sudden shift in the room's posture, people heard it. Avery was already moving before the last syllable of Colton's outburst hit the floor. She stepped off the dance platform with a kind of urgency that didn't match her wedding dress, which had been designed for graceful drifting, not quick decisions. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble as she pushed through guests too stunned to pretend they weren't watching. When she reached us, her face was pale but resolved, her voice tight with emotion. "Did he just rip that off you?" she asked, eyes darting between me, Kai, and the broken chain in my hand. I nodded once. "He did." She turned on Colton without hesitation, her voice louder, now public. "What is wrong with you?" she asked. "It's my wedding day. Do you really think this is the legacy we want to showcase, violence in a tuxedo?" Her words hit harder than she probably realized, not just because they were true, but because they came from inside the wall. From someone they hadn't expected to defect. James arrived seconds later, placing a steadying hand on her back, his eyes scanning the scene. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly, but his gaze stopped on the necklace in my hand and the expression on Kai's face. "It was nothing," Colton said, brushing imaginary lint off his lapel. "Some people can't handle being reminded of their own choices." James didn't respond to him. Instead, he looked directly at Kai. "Are you Daniel?" Kai Evans, from Haven Frame. Kai blinked. "Yes, I am." There was a pause, then James extended his hand with a tone that shifted the temperature of the entire room. "It's an honor. I've followed your work for years." Guests nearby leaned in. The name had landed. Suddenly, curiosity replaced disdain. Whispers began to ripple through the room like wind across a field. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else whispered, "That's her husband. He's the one from that interview about media ethics and refugee storytelling." Within minutes, everything I had built, all those silent years of work and healing, became real to these people for the refugee storytelling. First time. Because someone in the right suit gave it shape. Meredith stepped forward next, trying to salvage control with the poise of someone whose entire world depended on appearances. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," she said sweetly. "These reunions are always so emotionally charged. But I'm thrilled you're here, Dove. Really. It means so much to Avery." I didn't respond. Not because I was withholding forgiveness, but because it was clear her performance was for the crowd, not for me. Kai, still calm, took the velvet box from his pocket and opened it. He retrieved the replacement chain and reattached the pendant without a word. Then he fastened it around my neck with hands that had built safety systems for people halfway around the world, and yet knew exactly how tight or loose a necklace should sit for comfort. Avery reached out gently. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now, trembling in a way that wasn't for show. "I should have included you in the ceremony, in the table arrangements. I let them manage everything and told myself it wasn't personal. But I know it was. And I'm sorry." I looked at her, and saw not the polished bride or the heir apparent, but the girl who used to whisper stories with a flashlight under a blanket. "It's not too late to make different choices," I said, and I meant it. Her eyes welled, but she nodded, and I saw something real in her for the first time in years. The DJ tried to recover the room by fading in a new track, but no one returned to dancing just yet. James guided Avery back to the head table, while Meredith quickly pivoted to speak with some out-of-town relatives, clearly hoping to reroute the narrative before it settled. Meanwhile, one by one, cousins and extended relatives began approaching me. Small comments, awkward compliments. "Didn't realize you were still in media," someone said. "I thought you went into non-profit work." I didn't explain the difference. I didn't need to. The shift had already occurred. By the time dessert was served, I was no longer sitting at table 18. Avery had asked me and Kai to move to the head table, filling in the seats of two no-show bridesmaids. Meredith objected at first, citing the seating chart and symmetry, but Avery shut her down with a look I had never seen her use before. A look that didn't ask for permission. As we settled into our new place under the lights, I realized this wasn't vindication. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even a moment of triumph. It was clarity. Not everyone who turns their back on you deserves a confrontation. Some just deserve distance. But some, like Avery, when they show up at the right moment and say, "I see what I did," they deserve a second look. Not blind trust, not return to old dynamics, but acknowledgement that change is possible. And as I sat there next to the man who never once asked me to shrink, wearing a necklace repaired by the same hands that helped me rebuild, I realized I hadn't come back to take anything from this place. I had come to remember that I no longer needed it. By the time the coffee was served, the temperature in the room had shifted. Not physically, but atmospherically. There was a difference in how people moved now, how their eyes landed and lingered. I wasn't being stared at like an outsider anymore, not quite. I was being studied. We were. Kai and I sat at the head table, our presence now part of the evening's unofficial narrative, one that whispered itself between champagne glasses and dessert forks. It was the kind of shift that happened slowly, then all at once, like a room deciding it had been looking in the wrong direction the whole time. Across the table, a distant cousin named Margot leaned in with the kind of tentative curiosity that always follows a power miscalculation. "I had no idea you and Kai were in tech," she said, drawing out the last word, as if it still confused her. I nodded. "Media infrastructure, technically. Ethical distribution systems, mostly through decentralized platforms." She blinked. "Wow, that sounds intense." I offered her a polite smile, knowing she wasn't looking for depth. Just a new story to tell. That was fine. I didn't need their understanding, only their discomfort. From the next table, Devon approached with 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Kai, like it might soften history. So he said, clearing his throat, "You're the team behind Havenframe. I think I saw your piece on algorithmic bias in content suppression. Brilliant stuff." Kai accepted the wine, but didn't drink. "That was mostly Dove," he said. "She wrote the framework we built the whole structure around." Devon's smile tightened. "Right. Well, congratulations. Seems like it's working out." It wasn't a compliment. It was a confession. One wrapped in resentment and unspoken apology. Across the room, Meredith hovered near the floral arch, pretending to admire the arrangements while keeping one eye on our table. I could practically hear the gears turning behind her expression, recalibrating my position on her mental hierarchy. For a woman who spent decades controlling perception, this moment must have tasted like vinegar. But even then, she didn't approach again. She understood enough to know that some retractions are better left unspoken. James, ever the diplomat, made his way over shortly after the music resumed. He greeted Kai with warmth that felt genuine, asking questions, not out of obligation, but interest. "We've been discussing ways to diversify our digital outreach," he said, lowering his voice so only we could hear. "Honestly, we've hit a wall. The younger demographics don't trust curated legacy media anymore," Kai nodded. "Because they shouldn't. Trust is a currency that has to be earned, not branded." James smiled like someone who had just heard a truth that made too much sense. "If you ever consult for outside partners," he said, "we'd be interested in a conversation." He looked at me directly as he added, "Both of you." For a long time, I had assumed that recognition would feel like redemption, that when the moment finally came, I would feel vindicated. But what I felt instead was distance, a healthy kind. Like hearing the applause of an audience I no longer performed for. I didn't need to forgive them to feel free, I just needed to stop asking them to see me. A younger cousin, Sophie, barely 17, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. She was nervous, holding a folded program like it was armor. "I've been following your work," she said quickly, as if afraid someone might stop her. I watched the artist interviews on Haven Frame. The one with the sculptor from Tunisia made me cry. Her eyes were wide, unfiltered. I started sketching again. I stopped for a while because Mom said it was a phase, but I don't know, seeing you made me think maybe it doesn't have to be. I felt something tighten in my throat. Not pain, something closer to hope. It doesn't, I said. If it speaks to you, that's reason enough. She handed me a small envelope. I drew something. You don't have to keep it. I just wanted you to know. You made someone in this family feel less alone. I took the envelope with both hands like it was glass. Thank you, I said softly. And I meant it more than anything else I'd said that night. Later, when the room emptied and the floor was littered with flower petals and the remnants of too many toasts, Kai and I stepped out into the quiet of the garden. The air had cooled, and the mountains loomed in the dark like silent witnesses. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded drawing from Sophie. It was rough but raw, honest. The lines weren't polished, but they were real. I turned to Kai. I think I want to sponsor a youth series on the platform. No polish, no branding. Just first drafts. First voices. He smiled. Sounds exactly like something you'd create. I leaned into his side, the broken necklace now repaired and warm against my skin. Funny, I said. I thought this trip would be about reclaiming something. But maybe it was about releasing it. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Some moments are too quiet to narrate out loud. We didn't leave right after the wedding. Our flight wasn't until Sunday afternoon, so Kai booked us an extra night at the inn just outside town, a quiet wooden building overlooking a lake that looked frozen from a distance, but still breathed gently under the morning mist. We had breakfast on the porch, wrapped in wool shawls. The host had kindly left at the entrance, sipping bitter coffee that tasted better simply because it was shared in silence. Neither of us said much at first. There was a heaviness to the stillness, not unpleasant, just reflective. The kind of silence that comes after a long-held wait, finally lifts, and you're not yet sure how to walk without it. I kept replaying moments from the night before, not the public ones, but the private ones. Sophie's drawing, James's offer, Avery's apology. None of them had been dramatic or cinematic. Just real, human. I thought about how much of my life I had spent waiting for one giant moment of validation, only to realize that small shifts seen clearly were far more powerful. I didn't need a headline. I just needed the right kind of gaze. Kai reached across the table and gently rested his hand over mine. You're quiet, he said, his voice soft enough to match the morning light. I nodded. I keep waiting for the feeling of victory, but it's not coming. He smiled slightly. That's because this wasn't a battle. It was a mirror. I looked at him, and the quiet understanding in his eyes made me feel grounded in a way I hadn't known I needed. So what do you see in the reflection, he asked. I paused. Someone who no longer waits for permission. That was the best answer I had. As we packed up later that morning, I checked my email out of habit. Buried among promotional spam and platform notifications was one message with the subject line, "Let's talk," from Colton. I opened it more out of curiosity than anticipation. It was short, formal, and precise, just like him. Dove, I'd like to meet for coffee before you leave town. I believe we both said things that deserve a second conversation. I'll respect your decision either way. No apology, no explanation. Just an offer, one that felt more like a test than a gesture. I showed the message to Kai, who read it without expression. Are you going? He asked. I shrugged. Not because I owe him anything, but maybe because I don't. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in town, neutral territory, mid-morning. The place was quiet when I arrived, Kai waiting nearby, in case it went sideways. Colton was already there, seated at a corner table, hands folded over a ceramic mug like he wasn't used to things that didn't come with handles made of polished brass. He stood when I arrived, gestured toward the empty seat, and said simply, "Thank you for coming." I sat without responding. Let him speak first. He cleared his throat. I've replayed last night more times than I care to admit. That wasn't how it should have gone. I stayed silent, he continued. I underestimated you. I assumed your absence meant failure, that your silence meant irrelevance. I see now I was wrong about that. I let the words land. They weren't warm, they weren't humble, but they were honest in a way I'd never heard from him. You don't have to forgive me, he said, looking directly at me. But I'm asking you to consider a different future. One where your name isn't erased from the family history but restored. I didn't flinch. You're not the one who gets to restore anything. I built my own version of legacy. And I'm not handing it back for a seat at a table I no longer trust. He nodded slowly. That's fair. The conversation shifted from apology to business. He asked vague questions about partnerships, hinted at media gaps the Quinn Group couldn't seem to fill without embarrassing themselves. I answered politely professionally, but kept my cards close. When the bill came, I paid before he could reach for his wallet. Not to prove anything. Just to make it clear the power dynamic had changed, and I no longer needed anything from this exchange. As we stood, he extended a hand. I took it briefly, then turned to leave. Outside, the sun was starting to break through the clouds. Kai leaned against the car watching me with the quiet patience I'd fallen in love with. So he asked as I approached. He wants me to join the legacy. I told him I already had one. Kai nodded. Sounds about right. We got in the car, the city growing smaller behind us. I glanced at the rearview mirror once, not with longing, but with closure. Some places will always be a part of your story, but that doesn't mean they still get to narrate it. 3 days after we returned to the city, I stood inside the old elevator of the Havenframe building, watching the numbers light up slowly. Our office wasn't large. It occupied a modest 2 floors of a converted garment warehouse in the Arts District. But there was something about the exposed beams, the sunlight that filtered through high windows in the late afternoon, and the handwritten sticky notes on every corner wall that made it feel more alive than any skyscraper full of men in the 7-day. Tailored suits and half-finished ideas. I stepped out into the open space, greeted by the faint hum of edit reels and the clack of someone manually splicing footage in the corner. No one stopped what they were doing to greet me, and that was how I liked it. This wasn't a company built on ego. It was built on clarity. My assistant had left a note on my desk, neatly folded with a simple line on the outside. UN invitation confirmed. I sat down and opened it. Inside was the final confirmation. I'd been invited to speak at the UN Digital Ethics Summit as the closing keynote. It wasn't something I had sought out or pitched for. They had found me, or rather found the work, the platform. The way Havenframe handled trauma-centered content, decentralized creator control, and audience transparency had caught the attention of groups far beyond our expected reach. I was being flown to Geneva the following month with full access to decision-makers, press, and researchers. But more than any of that, they had asked for the story. Not numbers, not projections, just truth. I stared at the letter for a moment, before placing it beside a worn-out notebook full of sketches from the early days. I remembered one page in particular, just a scribbled thought Kai and I had bounced around over midnight ramen during a power outage. What if truth didn't need to be loud? What if it just needed to be unshakable? I smiled. Somehow, we had made that real. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the glass towers outside my apartment, I sat on the balcony and Kai's oversized sweater feet curled under me, cradling a mug of ginger tea. The city buzzed below unaware, and that was okay. I didn't need everyone to know. Just the right people. Kai stepped outside and handed me a small envelope, his expression unreadable. It's from Avery, he said. I took it carefully, opened it, and read. Dove, I wanted you to hear it directly from me. James and I decided not to take the advisory board seat at the Quinn Group. We're launching an initiative under our own name focused on ethical design in legacy institutions. If you ever want to collaborate, there's a seat for you by choice, not inheritance. Thank you for showing me another way. With care, Avery. I reread it slowly, the words calm and without pressure. She wasn't asking me to fix anything. She was just letting me know that she had started. That someone I had once believed lost to expectation had chosen to reroute her direction entirely. I handed the letter back to Kai and exhaled deeply. That girl under the blanket with the flashlight made it out, I said. And somehow, she left a map behind. That weekend, I met with Sophie again. She was visiting the city with her mom, but snuck away for an hour to tour our studio. She walked through the rows of editing desks and quiet pods, like someone in a cathedral, reverent but electric with curiosity. She asked about our submission process, our mentorship cycles, and how long it took to build a digital audience without selling your soul to the algorithm. I gave her real answers, not polished ones. I showed her the walls where first drafts lived. I let her sit in my chair and flip through early concept books where our biggest mistakes had been inked without shame. Before she left, she asked if she could intern the next summer. "If you're still drawing," I said, "and still questioning everything around you, then yes, you'll fit right in." That night, I wrote my keynote in a single sitting. Not about revenge, not about validation, but about quiet power. About what happens when you stop performing for approval and start building for meaning. I wrote about the difference between being impressive and being impactful. And I ended with the only sentence that had stayed with me since that wedding. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop needing to be welcomed back. Because legacy isn't about names carved into buildings or initials on stationery. It's about whose silence you interrupted, whose voice you lifted, whose life you made feel possible. The auditorium lights dimmed as I walked onto the stage, not out of drama but design. A spotlight followed me, gentle and non-intrusive, like the tone I had chosen for my speech. I wasn't there to convince or to perform. I was there to offer a window, not into success but into clarity. My voice didn't waver as I began. I told them about our project, about Haven Frame, and about what it meant to build something without asking permission. I told them about my cousin's wedding, not in anger but in context, because sometimes the stories we try hardest to escape are the ones that shape our most honest work. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I described how we built systems not to silence anyone, but to prevent voices from being buried under louder ones. I talked about bias, but more importantly, I talked about intention, about how every product, platform, and policy either amplifies or erases, and how too often women like me have learned to edit ourselves before anyone else can, but not anymore. At the end of my talk, I looked out into the audience and let the final thought land slowly. "The most powerful revenge is not success," I said calmly. "It's choosing not to return to the table that once made you beg for crumbs." There was no applause at first, just stillness. Then a wave of quiet clapping built, not thunderous but meaningful. It wasn't about me. It was about the space I had opened. Afterward, at the reception, I spoke with researchers, founders, and activists who had been following our work without me knowing. They weren't interested in my past. They were focused on our systems, our models, and the questions we were daring to ask. I left that summit not with a trophy or a headline, but with 12 new collaborations and a quiet knowing that I no longer needed to chase recognition. I had become the kind of person who created it for others. On the plane ride home, I watched the clouds blur against the windows and thought about the last time I sat in a seat like this, dreading a family gathering I hadn't asked to attend. Now I was flying away from the kind of validation I had once believed was necessary. There's something sacred about no longer needing to be understood by the people who misjudged you. It frees you to create your own meaning without negotiation. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. It was from Sophie. Inside was a small sketchbook, hand-bound with thread and filled with pencil drawings of women speaking, building, crying, laughing. There was a note tucked into the back flap. "These are based on stories I've been listening to on the platform. I think I want to become a documentary illustrator. Thank you for showing me that truth doesn't always need polish." I held the book for a long time before placing it on my shelf between two thick volumes of media ethics and cultural theory. It fit perfectly, not because of its academic weight, but because of its raw truth. That night I sat at the kitchen table with Kai, eating leftover dumplings and watching the city breathe through our tall windows. I asked him, "Do you ever think we needed that wedding?" He looked at me thoughtful. "Not for them. But maybe for you." I nodded. It was the last time I asked for space that wasn't freely given. He poured us both more tea and smiled. "Now you build the rooms." Sometimes healing doesn't look like a confrontation. It looks like choosing a different direction entirely. It looks like not responding to the next passive-aggressive group message. It looks like skipping the next reunion. It looks like showing up for yourself in the way others never could. And sometimes it looks like letting your silence say more than any monologue ever could. We didn't go back to visit for Christmas that year. No dramatic fallout, no bitter announcement. Just a quiet decision to stay in our own space with people who never made us shrink to fit their version of love. Instead, we hosted a small gathering with creators, students, and voices that deserved a seat at a better table. No hierarchy, no performance, just truth in its simplest form. Because in the end, the question isn't how many people finally clapped for you. It's who you became when they didn't. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself in silence, only to realize you'd outgrown the very room you once fought to enter?